Hello Year 8, welcome to today's lesson on converting between fractions, decimals and percentages. Please roll off where you got to last lesson, record the date and the title, and have a go at today's Do Now task, which is to record 3 fractions equivalent to each of the following below. Please pause the video whilst you do this. Right, well done. I'm just going to show you some examples of some of the answers you may have. Some of them will be much more straightforward than others, I would expect. So you may have 2 quarters and 3 sixths as equivalent to a half, 2 over 20 and 3 over 30. You have 2 eighths and 3 twelfths as equivalent to a quarter, 2 tenths and 3 15ths. For 3 quarters you may have gone for 6 eighths and 9 over 12. You may have gone for 2 16ths and 3 24ths. You may have gone for 14 over 20 and 21 over 30 as equivalent to 7 tenths. And for 1/3 you may have gone for 2 sixths and 3 ninths. Today's hook question focuses around percentages and fractions. You may choose to look back at this later and answer the key questions below once we've been through today's lesson. Our success criteria today is a review of Year 7 work, so some of you may choose spend a little bit longer on this than others depending on how confident you feel. So your bronze criteria is to be able to convert fluently between halves and tenths as fractions, decimals, percentages. Silver is to convert quarters and fifths, and gold is to convert eighths into decimals and percentages. Here's your first cold call question, another question that you may choose to look at to stretch and challenge you a little later on once you feel confident with the content. So our first criteria today is the bronze criteria, and we'll look at converting a half into percentages and decimals. So if we start with a half, best practice will be to convert the half into a fraction over 100. In order to get from 2 to 100, you would multiply your denominator by 50, and then you would also multiply your numerator by 50. And we can see that we get an answer of 50 over 100, and if you look at the 100 square grid to the right, you can see 50 of the 100 squares have been highlighted. Therefore, if we know a half is equivalent to 50 over 100, we should know that a half is equivalent to 0.5 and 50%. If we were to display that on a number line that's perfectly split into 10 equal parts, your arrow would be above the 5th section. Please copy the worked example down in your exercise book and pause the video whilst you do this. Right, next we will look at converting tenths to fractions, decimals and percentages. So here's our fraction of 1/10, and to write it as a fraction over 100, we would multiply our denominator of 10 by 10 to get 100, and therefore we would multiply our numerator of 1 by 10 to get 10 over 100. You can see from the 100 square grid to the right, it is split into 10 equal columns of 10 squares, which highlights the fact that it will be 10 out of 100. If 1/10 is equivalent to 10 over 100, we should therefore know that 1/10 is equivalent to 0.1 and also 10%. From this information, we could identify that we would show that on a number line by putting the arrow above the first marker. From this information, if you just have a careful think, you should be able to convert 2/10 into decimals and percentages as well. Please copy the worked example down in your exercise book, and then in your exercise book record the following fractions as their equivalent decimals and percentages, and if you would like to, you can draw a number line to represent each conversion. Please pause the video whilst you do this. Right, well done. Please get your marking pen ready. You should now know that 3/10 is equivalent to 30 over 100, which is 0.3 and 30%. You should also know that 4/10 is equivalent to 40 over 100, which would be 0.4 and 40%. You should also know that 8/10 is 8 over 100, which is 0.8 and 80%. You will notice that after the 0.3, the 0.4 and the 0.8, we don't have to put the zeros in to represent the 30, the 40 and the 80, and this is because that final zero represents no place value, so it isn't necessary. If we now look at quarters, there's our initial fraction, and once again we would show it as a fraction over 100. To get from 4 to 100, we multiply by 25. So write an equivalent fraction of a quarter as a fraction over 100. You also multiply your numerator by 25, and we'd get 25 over 100, and you can see on the right from our 100 square grid that would be exactly a quarter of the square. Now that we know a quarter is equivalent to 25 over 100, we should therefore know that a quarter is equivalent to 0.25 and 25%. Copy down the worked example in your exercise book, then record in your exercise book what the following are as decimals and percentages. Be sure to show the equivalent fraction over 100. Please pause the video whilst you do this. Right, well done. Please have your marking pen ready. You should have had 2 quarters as equivalent to 50 over 100, and therefore you would have 50% and 0.5 as your percentage and your decimal.
you should have 3/4 as 75 over 100, and you will therefore have 75% and 0.75. Notice for these two, we have 0.5 only for 50% and 0.75 for 75%. That's because the 7 and the 5 of the 0.75 hold place value. Right, if we now look at our fifths, we write our initial fraction as 1/5, and then we would write it as a fraction over 100. And we know from our 5 times table, to get from 5 to 100, we multiply our denominator by 20. So we therefore must do the same to the top. We multiply 1 by 20, and we can see from our 100 square grid on the right hand side, that would be 2 of our columns of 10, which is quite right. We get an answer of 20 over 100. Because we know 1/5 is equivalent to 20 over 100, we should therefore know that 1/5 is equivalent to 0.2, which is also 20%. Could you have converted 1/5 to an alternative fraction in order to find the equivalent decimal percentages? Well, you could have done. You could have had 2/10, you could have had 3/15, and many more. What is 2/5 as a decimal and a percentage? Well, if 2/10 is equivalent to 4 over 10, for example, it would be 0.4 or 40%. Copy down the worked example in your exercise book, then record in your exercise book what the following are as decimals and percentages, and be sure to show the equivalent fraction over 100. Please pause the video whilst you do this. Well done, please have your marking pen ready. So we should have 2/5 as equivalent to 40 over 100, which is 40% and therefore 0.4. We should have 3/5 as 60 over 100, which will be 60% and 0.6. And we should have 4/5 as 80 over 100, which is 80% and 0.8. So our last fraction that we'll be converting to decimals and percentages today is the 1/8. So there's our 1/8. Will we try and convert it into a fraction over 100? Well, no, we won't, not this time, because 8 isn't easy to multiply to get 100. But we do know what a quarter looks like. We know it's 25 of those squares. So if we half that amount, we get 12.5 squares. So now we know that 1/8 is equivalent to 12.5 out of 100, which we can now write as 0.125 and 12.5%. Notice when you have a percentage that's less than 100, all of your numbers go after the decimal point. Copy down the worked example in your exercise book, then record in your exercise book what the following are as decimals and percentages. Please pause the video whilst you do this. Very well done. Please have your marking pen ready. So 3/8 we should have as 0.375 and 37.5%. 5/8 we should have as 0.625 and 62.5%, and 7/8 we should have as 0.875 and 87.5%. We can now look at some problem solving questions. The question says 72% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. Tick all answers below which represent the percentage of Earth which is not covered by water. That means if 72% is water, 100 take away 72 is 28, so 28% isn't. Therefore we know that 0.28 does represent that 28%. We know that 28 over 100 is equivalent to 56 over 200, so that is also representative of 28%. 0.72 does not represent 28%, and neither does 36 over 100, which will be equivalent to 72 out of 100. We know that 7 over 25, if we times the numerator and the denominator by 4, we get 28 over 100, and it is therefore equivalent to 28%. Have a look at this question, see if you can answer it. Think about what Juan's done wrong. He thinks 1/3 equals 30%. Prove that Juan is wrong. Please pause the video whilst you do this. Well done. So we should know that 30% is equivalent to 3 over 10, and we know that 3 over 10 does not simplify to 1/3. 3 over 10 is a fraction in its most simple form, and therefore 1/3 could not be equivalent to 30%. Now look at this non-standard example, have a read of it carefully and see if you can solve it, show you're working out clearly, and we'll go through it in a moment. Please pause the video whilst you do this. Well done. We'll start with the red counters. So we should know that 2/5 is equivalent to 4 over 10, which is equivalent to 40 over 100, which will be 40%. We also know the blue counters represent 50 over 100. That represents 55 over 100 in total of red and blue, which is 55%, which means that 45 over 100 represents our green counters, which would be 45%. Please now complete the worksheet in your workbook, and you'll also be able to access the answers on the Home Learning Centre under Maths for Year 8. Once you've done so, please feel free to have a go at the true and false questions. If 1/2 is equivalent to 0.5, that must mean that 2/4 is also 0.5. True. If 1/8 is equivalent to 12.5, that must mean that 2/8 is worth 25%. True. 0.3 is equivalent to 1/3. That's false, as we know that 0.3 is equivalent to 3/10. You must convert fractions into an equivalent fraction over 100 before finding the equivalent decimal and percentage. We know that's not always the case, as we found with our eighths work. 1/4 minus 1/5 equals 0.05. This goes back to our work on adding and subtracting fractions. Please pause the video whilst you try and work this out. And the answer is true. Please feel free to have a go at the "is this correct" problem solving questions, and then have a look at this diagnostic question: which of the following are equivalent to 1/3?